On the morning of March 4, 1924, a man named Abdulhamid climbed into a car in Istanbul and was driven to the Sadalka train station on the European edge of the city. He carried 2 suitcases. He was accompanied by 2 servants and his son. He was 59 years old, a painter of serious reputation, a man who had spent his life in the libraries and studios of the imperial palace, and he held a title that no human being would ever hold again. He was the Caliph of all Islam, the formal successor to the Prophet Muhammad in the governance of the Muslim community, the holder of an office that had existed in various forms for 1,300 years. The night before, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey had voted to abolish the Caliphate. Now the last caliph was on a train to Switzerland, with his 2 suitcases, carrying nothing that could not fit in a compartment. There was no ceremony. There was no public farewell. A gendarmerie officer was present to ensure the departure was orderly. The Ottoman dynasty, which had governed an empire stretching from Budapest to Baghdad, from the Nile to the Caspian Sea, which had held the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, which had administered one of the most complex multi-ethnic, multi-religious states in the history of the world for 600 years, was over. Not with a battle, not with a foreign conquest, but with a train at dawn and a man with 2 suitcases. This is the story of how that happened. The Ottoman Empire at its peak, in the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent in the mid-16th century, was a thing of genuine structural sophistication. It was not simply a conquest state that happened to last a long time. It had a legal system, the Kanuni, the law code that Suleiman himself had helped codify, blending Islamic Sharia with customary law in a hierarchy that was intelligible, consistent, and widely applied. It had a governing class produced by a remarkable institution called the Devshirm, the periodic levy of boys from Christian families in the Balkans, who were brought to Istanbul, converted to Islam, educated in the palace schools, and trained as administrators, soldiers, and generals. These men had no hereditary loyalties to provincial noble families, no tribal affiliations, no inherited land. Their careers depended entirely on the Sultan's favor. They were, in a structural sense, the perfect instrument of centralized imperial governance, capable, educated, and bound to the state alone. The empire governed its non-Muslim subjects through the millet system, a framework that granted each recognized religious community. The Greek Orthodox, Armenian, and Jewish millets were the primary ones, legal autonomy over personal law, marriage, inheritance, religious education, communal governance. A Greek Christian in Istanbul lived under the jurisdiction of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate for personal matters, paid taxes to the Ottoman state as a subject, and could trade, own property, and pursue a profession largely as he liked. It was not equality. Non-Muslims paid additional taxes, were barred from certain offices, and faced legal asymmetries in relations with Muslims. But it was a functional framework for governing religious plurality across a territory containing dozens of distinct communities, and it worked well enough for centuries. The Ottoman navy dominated the eastern Mediterranean. The empire's position astride the trade routes between Europe and Asia made it a critical commercial intermediary. Istanbul, which the Ottomans called Constantinople and the world called Constantinople, was one of the great cities of the world. Its skyline of domes and minarets visible from the sea, its bazaars and workshops and printing, houses the center of a commercial culture that linked the Adriatic to the Persian Gulf. This was the world that Suleiman bequeathed to his successors. The problem is that what Suleiman bequeathed was a peak, not a foundation. The institutions that had made the empire strong in 1550 were, by 1700, either eroded, captured by entrenched interests, or simply no longer suited to the changed world they faced. The Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that had been the Ottoman army's cutting edge for 2 centuries, had become something else entirely. What had once been a professional military caste selected by merit was now a hereditary guild. Sons joined the corps. Janissaries went into business. They owned shops, ran trades, collected salaries without serving. When sultans tried to reform or replace the corps, the Janissaries revolted, And Ottoman history is littered with sultans who were deposed or killed when they pushed the Janissaries too hard. The core was untouchable and unusable, a protection racket dressed as a military institution. Outside, the world was changing faster than the Janissaries could absorb. European armies after 1650 were transforming. Professional infantry drilled in linear tactics, artillery that could reduce fortifications in weeks rather than months, logistic systems that could supply armies in the field for an entire campaign season without pillage. The Ottomans were not ignorant of these changes, but the Janissaries blocked every serious attempt to build a competing force. The empire's military technology and doctrine fell progressively behind the European powers, and the gap showed in the outcomes of every major war from 1683 onward. The Battle of Vienna in 1683 is the hinge. The Ottoman army that besieged Vienna was enormous. Estimates range from 90,000 to 200,000 men, but it was commanded by Kara Mustafa Pasha, who combined strategic boldness with tactical inflexibility, and it was opposed by a relief army led by the Polish King Jan Roman III Sobieski and a coalition of Habsburg, Saxon, and Bavarian forces. The relief charge on September 12, 1683 broke the Ottoman siege lines and sent the Ottoman army into a disorderly retreat. Kara Mustafa was strangled by order of the Sultan on Christmas Day of that year, but the true consequence of Vienna was not felt for another 15 years. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 formalized what the battlefield had demonstrated. The Ottomans were no longer expanding in Europe. They were retreating. Hungary, Transylvania, and the Mora were gone. The long contraction had begun. That contraction was not steady or swift. The empire remained a major power for 2 more centuries. It fought Russia, Austria, France, and Britain in various combinations, winning some wars and losing others. It maintained control of the Arab provinces, the Black Sea coast, the Danube Valley, and most of the Balkans well into the 19th century. But each generation of territorial loss made the next loss easier. The revenues that had supported the palace, the army, and the administrative apparatus came from the provinces. As provinces were lost, revenues fell. As revenues fell, the army shrank or its quality declined. As the army shrank, more provinces became vulnerable. The critical structural failure arrived not as a dramatic defeat, but as a financial document. By the 1850, the Ottomans had been borrowing from European banks to finance wars and maintain the apparatus of the state. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, fought against Russia, with British and French support, was won, but it was won on credit. The empire borrowed massively from London and Paris at interest rates that reflected a creditor's assessment of a debtor's future. By 1875, the empire was spending more than half its total revenues on debt service alone. In 1876, it defaulted on its foreign debt. 5 years later, in 1881, the consequence of that default was formalized in an institution called the Public Debt Administration. European creditors, primarily British and French bondholders, were granted direct administrative control of 6 major Ottoman revenue streams: salt, tobacco, spirits, silk, stamps, and the tribute from Bulgaria and Cyprus. Ottoman officials collected these revenues and handed them to a European-staffed administration before a single penny reached the treasury in Istanbul. The empire was still sovereign in name. In the matter of its own finances, it was a supervised dependency. The Sultan who inherited this situation was Abdulhamid II, who came to the throne in 1876 under the most promising circumstances imaginable. He agreed to promulgate an Ottoman constitution, the first in the empire's history, convening a parliament and promising a new era of constitutional government. The constitution was drafted by the reformist Grand Vizier Midhat Pasha and represented the most sophisticated statement of Ottoman political liberalism: equal citizenship regardless of religion, parliamentary representation for all communities, an independent judiciary. The first Ottoman parliament convened in March 1877. It lasted 2 years. In 1878, in the aftermath of a catastrophic war against Russia, a war in which Ottoman forces were routed and Russian cavalry reached the suburbs of Istanbul before British diplomatic pressure halted the advance, Abdulhamid suspended the constitution and dissolved parliament. He would rule without one for the next 30 years. The 1877 to 1878 Russo-Ottoman War deserves more than a single sentence because it was the event that made everything that followed possible. The empire lost Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, and Bulgaria in a single treaty. It lost enormous territories in the Caucasus. It lost roughly a third of its remaining European population. And across those lost territories, hundreds of thousands of Ottoman Muslims, people whose families had lived in the Balkans for generations, were expelled, killed, or forced to flee to Anatolia. Contemporary European accounts estimated over 1 million Muslim refugees. They arrived in Anatolia with nothing, traumatized and politically radicalizing, carrying a memory of what nationalist uprisings backed by foreign powers actually produced. Their presence in Anatolia would shape the political psychology of the late Ottoman period in ways that have not been fully reckoned with in Western accounts of the empire's collapse. Abdulhamid understood the lessons of 1878 through a particular lens. Constitutionalism and liberal reform had encouraged the nationalist separatism that the European powers then used as a pretext to intervene on behalf of Christian minorities. The solution, in his view, was not more liberalism but stronger central authority and a reassertion of Islamic identity as the empire's binding principle. He built a vast intelligence and surveillance apparatus, deploying secret agents across the empire and among Ottoman communities in Europe. He invested in telegraph and railway infrastructure to project military and administrative authority into distant provinces. He cultivated the religious establishment and emphasized the caliphal role, the sultan as the protector and spiritual head of all Muslims, as the empire's unifying claim in a world that was stripping away its territories one by one. He was not a stupid man. His analysis of the empire's situation was, in many respects, acute. The problem was that his chosen solutions were insufficient. The telegraph could report a provincial rebellion, but it could not prevent one. The caliphal claim could bind Muslim subjects emotionally, but it could not pay the army. The intelligence apparatus could identify dissenters and exile or execute them, but it could not produce the modernized economy and military that were the only real answer to the empire's structural vulnerability. In 1908, that vulnerability was exposed by the men who were supposed to be the empire's military bulwark. The Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP, known in European languages as the Young Turks, had been organizing for years in the military academies and provincial garrisons of the empire's European territories. Its members were young officers who had received modern educations and who looked at the empire's condition with the clinical frustration of people who knew what needed to be done and were blocked at every turn. The CUP was not ideologically homogeneous. It contained secular nationalists, Ottoman patriots who wanted to restore the multi-ethnic constitutional state, pan-Turkic ideologists who dreamed of a union of all Turkic peoples, and pragmatists who simply wanted to stop losing wars. What united them was the conviction that Abdulhamid's 30-year personal rule had made the empire weaker, not stronger, and that constitutional government was the only basis on which modernization could proceed. In July 1908, 2 CUP officers in Macedonia, Niyazi Bey and Enver Bey, mutinied rather than face arrest by Abdulhamid's secret police. They took to the mountains with their men and declared for the constitution. Other garrisons followed. Abdulhamid, calculating that he lacked the reliable troops to suppress the revolt, made a decision that perhaps only he could have made. He restored the constitution without a fight. On July 24, 1908, the 1876 constitution was reinstated. Political prisoners were released. The censorship was lifted. Parliament was reconvened. The scenes that followed in the streets of Istanbul and Salonika have the quality of a dream. Greeks and Turks embraced in public squares. Rabbis and imams gave speeches from the same platforms. Men who had been in exile for their political opinions returned home to crowds. For a brief, incandescent moment, it seemed possible to believe that the Ottoman constitutional experiment would succeed where it had failed in 1878, that a reformed, modernizing, constitutionally governed empire could survive the pressures that had been tearing it apart. It did not last, and it did not last for reasons that were structural rather than accidental. The CUP's internal disagreements became apparent almost immediately. The liberal constitutionalists who wanted a genuinely multi-ethnic, decentralized parliament were in conflict with the centralizing Turkish nationalists who wanted a stronger state governed by a cohesive Turkish Muslim majority. The non-Muslim and non-Turkish communities that had celebrated the revolution in 1908 quickly found that their vision of what constitutional government meant was not the CUP's vision. When they formed their own parties and organized their own political movements, CUP leaders perceived this as separatism rather than politics. In April 1909, a counter-revolutionary movement, soldiers and religious conservatives who wanted Abdulhamid back, or at least wanted the CUP's secular modernizers removed, mutinied in Istanbul. The March 31 incident, as it was called in the Ottoman calendar, required the CUP to march an army from Salonika to suppress it. When the army arrived, Abdulhamid was formally deposed. His compliant brother was installed as Mehmed V, a sultan with the title but none of the authority, while the CUP's parliamentary faction governed in his name. And then the disasters came, almost without pause. Italy attacked Libya in 1911, stripping the empire of its last North African province in a war that the Ottomans could not effectively fight because they could not move troops to Libya without naval dominance they no longer had. A young officer named Mustafa Kemal led an Ottoman advisory team that organized local resistance, learning lessons about guerrilla warfare and nationalist mobilization that he would use again. The empire ceded Tripolitania and Cyrenaica. Libya was gone. Then came the Balkan Wars. In October 1912, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro launched coordinated attacks on the remaining Ottoman territory in Europe. The speed of the collapse was staggering. Within 6 weeks, Ottoman armies had been pushed out of Macedonia and most of Thrace. Edirne, Adrianople, one of the great Ottoman imperial cities, capital of the empire before Constantinople, fell. Bulgarian cavalry advanced to within 30 miles of Istanbul's walls. In 6 weeks, the empire lost territory it had held for 5 centuries, the land from which the Ottoman state itself had emerged. The peace that ended the First Balkan War was barely signed before the Second began. Bulgaria, dissatisfied with its share, attacked its former allies. The Ottomans seized the opportunity to retake Edirne, which they did. But the net result of both wars was still catastrophic. 83% of the empire's remaining European territory gone, nearly 70% of its European population lost. Hundreds of thousands more Muslim refugees poured into Anatolia. The CUP liberals who had believed in constitutional multi-ethnic government were discredited. In a coup within the CUP in January 1913, 3 men seized control of the government: Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Semel Pasha. The 3 pashas would govern the empire for the next 5 years and drive it to final destruction. Enver Pasha, the youngest and most ambitious, was the key figure. He was brilliant in the way that brilliant people who lack judgment are often brilliant. He had genuine courage, genuine energy, and a complete inability to distinguish between what he wanted to be true and what actually was. He had fought in Libya. He had helped retake Edirne. He admired the German military above all others, and was convinced that German reorganization could rebuild the Ottoman army into a force that could recover the empire's lost position. He was 32 years old when he became effective commander of the Ottoman military, and he had never commanded a large force in a major campaign. In the summer of 1914, As the European powers cascaded toward war, Enver concluded a secret alliance with Germany. His calculation, which seemed reasonable to a man who had watched his empire lose every war fought without a European patron, was that Germany was the most powerful military force in Europe, that German victory would allow the Ottomans to recover lost territories and escape the grip of British and French creditors, and that the German military mission, already embedded in Istanbul, could complete the army's modernization faster than any other path. In late October 1914, Enver arranged for a German admiral commanding 2 German warships sailing under Ottoman flags to attack Russian Black Sea ports. Russia declared war. Britain and France followed. The die was cast before the Ottoman cabinet had formally voted to enter the war at all. What followed was a military catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale. In December 1914, Enver personally commanded an Ottoman offensive in the mountains of eastern Anatolia intended to encircle Russian forces at Sarikamish. He was attempting a Napoleonic encirclement in winter conditions that made the operation nearly impossible from the start. Temperatures dropped to -30. Supply lines failed. The Ottoman Third Army, attacking through snowfields without adequate clothing or food, disintegrated. Of roughly 95,000 soldiers who began the campaign, perhaps 18,000 survived as an organized military force. The rest were dead, most of them from cold, starvation, and disease, not from Russian bullets. Enver returned to Istanbul and told no one what had happened. He was looking for explanations, and he found one in the Armenian population of eastern Anatolia. The Armenians of eastern Anatolia were a Christian minority, predominantly concentrated in the 6 vilayets provinces of Van, Bitlis, Erzurum, Diyarbakir, Mamouredulazes, and Sivas. They had been subjects of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. They had experienced communal violence in the 1890s under Abdulhamid. In 1915, in the aftermath of Sarikamish, the CUP leadership ordered their deportation. The entire Armenian population of eastern Anatolia was to be removed from its homes and marched to the Syrian desert. The orders went to governors and military commanders across the eastern provinces. Some refused and were removed. Most complied. What happened in 1915 was not a military operation gone wrong. It was the systematic elimination of a people. Armenian men were typically separated from their families and shot in ravines and fields by firing squads or irregular cavalry units. Women, children, and the elderly were marched south for hundreds of miles through summer heat without food or water, attacked by irregular forces along the route, stripped of their possessions, and left to die in the Syrian desert south of Deir ez-Zor. Contemporary German diplomatic reports from Germany, the empire's ally, describe what was happening with clinical precision: organized massacre, deliberate starvation, a policy designed to ensure that the Armenians of Anatolia would not return. Estimates of deaths range from 600,000 to over 1 million. Entire cities that had been majority Armenian for centuries, Van, Erzurum, Diyarbakir, were emptied. The Armenian population of eastern Anatolia, which had existed continuously for thousands of years, was gone within a year. In the West, in 1915, the empire achieved something it had not managed in years: a genuine military victory. The British and Anzac landings at Gallipoli, intended to force open the Dardanelles, capture Istanbul, and knock the Ottomans out of the war, were met by Ottoman defenses that held at the cost of appalling casualties on both sides. A lieutenant colonel named Mustafa Kemal, commanding at the critical heights of Chunuk Bair, issued orders to his men that have since become part of Turkish national mythology. "I am not ordering you to attack. I am ordering you to die. In the time that passes until we die, other troops and commanders can come and take our places." The positions held. The Allies, after 9 months of combat and over 200,000 dead on each side, withdrew in December 1915. Gallipoli was a real Ottoman military success, and it gave the empire another 3 years. But 3 years of what? The Arab provinces were rising. Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, the guardian of the holiest sites in Islam, operating from the heart of the empire's religious legitimacy, launched the Arab Revolt in June 1916, encouraged and supplied by Britain. T.E. Lawrence, the British liaison officer who would later write about the revolt in Seven Pillars of Wisdom, helped organize and publicize it. The Ottoman Caliphate's claim to represent all Muslims was being contradicted by the Caliph's own Arab subjects taking up arms against him. At the same moment, British and French diplomats were secretly drawing the map of the post-Ottoman Arab world. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of May 1916, signed by Britain's Mark Sykes and France's François-Georges Picot, divided the Arab portions of the empire between the two powers after the war: French control in Syria and Lebanon, British control in Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. The lines were drawn with rulers on maps. They ignored tribe, sect, and community. They exist on modern maps today. By 1917, the end was visible even if it was not yet acknowledged. British forces captured Baghdad in March 1917. Jerusalem fell in December. The Palestine front was crumbling. German forces were struggling to hold the Western Front and could spare nothing for their Ottoman ally. American entry into the war had made the ultimate outcome of the war clear to anyone who could read an order of battle. The final Ottoman military collapse came in September 1918. General Edmund Allenby's British forces launched an offensive at Megiddo that shattered the Ottoman army in Palestine. In 6 days, what remained of Ottoman military power in the Arab theater ceased to exist as an organized force. The Bulgarian front collapsed simultaneously, opening a path through Thrace toward Istanbul. On October 30, 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros. The terms were unconditional in everything except name. All Arab provinces surrendered, the Dardanelles opened, the army demobilized, Allied occupation of any strategic point permitted at discretion. Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Semel Pasha fled Istanbul on a German submarine 4 days before the armistice was signed. They would not remain free for long. An Armenian organization called Operation Nemesis, named for the Greek goddess of retribution, systematically hunted them. Talat Pasha was shot dead on a Berlin street in March 1921 by Soghaman Taylirian, an Armenian survivor of the 1915 deportations. The German court acquitted Taylirian after he described what he had witnessed. Semel Pasha was shot in Tiflis in July 1922. Enver Pasha died in August 1922, leading a Basmachi cavalry charge against the Red Army in Central Asia, chasing a pan-Turkic fantasy to the end. Allied warships sailed through the Bosphorus in November 1918. British, French, Italian, and Greek forces occupied various parts of the former empire. In Paris, diplomats began the work of partition. The resulting 1920 Treaty of Sevres, imposed on the Ottoman government in Istanbul, awarded eastern Anatolia to an Armenian state, the Aegean coast around Izmir to Greek administration, and Kurdistan to an autonomous zone. It stripped the Ottoman state of sovereignty over its remaining finances and military. The Sultan's government in Istanbul signed it because the Sultan's government had no army and was operating under Allied occupation. But there was someone else. Mustafa Kemal had returned from his wartime commands from Gallipoli, from the Caucasus Front, from Syria, to Istanbul in November 1918, a decorated general in a defeated army. He was 37 years old. He had been at Gallipoli when it mattered, and he was not associated with the three Pashas' disasters. He was politically astute, personally formidable, and possessed of a realistic assessment of what had happened, and what could still be salvaged from the wreckage. He had no patience for the collaborationist Ottoman government that was negotiating terms with the Allies in Istanbul. He had even less patience for the idea that the empire as it had existed could or should be preserved. In May 1919, when Greek troops landed at Izmir under Allied authorization and violence against the Muslim population began immediately, Kemal was sent to Anatolia, nominally, to oversee the demobilization of remaining Ottoman forces. He used the position to do the opposite. In June 1919, he organized the Erzurum and Sivas Congresses, where nationalist delegates declared that Anatolia and Eastern Thrace were inseparable from the Turkish homeland, and that no partition would be accepted. In April 1920, he established a Grand National Assembly in Ankara, a parallel government, explicitly rejecting the authority of the Allied-occupied Istanbul administration. The Sultan in Istanbul declared Kemal a rebel and ordered his execution in absentia. Kemal ignored the order. What followed from 1919 to 1922 was the Turkish War of Independence, a series of campaigns fought simultaneously on multiple fronts. In the east, Turkish nationalist forces defeated the Armenian Republic in a brutal winter campaign in 1920, ending the Armenian state that the Treaty of Sevres had notionally created and retaking the Kars region. In the south, they fought French forces in Cilicia to a negotiated stalemate. In the west, they fought the Greek army. The Greek campaign was the largest and the most consequential. The Greek government, encouraged by the Allies and driven by the irredentist vision of a megali idea, a greater Greece recovering the ancient Hellenic lands of Anatolia, advanced far into the Anatolian interior. By the summer of 1921, Greek forces were within 50 miles of Ankara. In August and September 1921, at the Battle of the Sakarya River, Kemal personally commanded the defense over 3 weeks of grinding, costly combat. The Greek advance was halted. Turkish forces stabilized their line. In September 1922, in a decisive offensive called the Great Offensive, Turkish forces shattered the Greek army and drove it to the sea at Izmir. What happened at Izmir in September 1922 was not a military operation alone. The city, an ancient cosmopolitan port that had been half Greek and half Armenian for centuries, a trading city of mixed communities and shared streets, was destroyed. A fire broke out in the Armenian quarter and spread through the Greek and Armenian districts. Turkish military forces blocked the harbor exits. The Allied warships in the harbor did not intervene. Estimates of civilian dead range from 10,000 to 100,000. Hundreds of thousands of Greek and Armenian civilians who had lived in Izmir for generations were evacuated by ship or fled. The cosmopolitan Izmir that had existed before September 1922 was gone. The Armistice of Mudanya in October 1922 acknowledged what the battlefield had produced. The Allies, who had been prepared to enforce the Treaty of Sevres, found they had no will to fight the Turkish nationalist army that had just defeated Greece. Britain's Prime Minister Lloyd George, who had been the strongest advocate for Greek expansion into Anatolia, found himself politically isolated as his cabinet refused to support military confrontation. The Lausanne negotiations began. In November 1922, 1 month after the Armistice of Mudanya, the Grand National Assembly voted to abolish the Ottoman Sultanate. Sultan Mehmed VI fled Istanbul on a British warship. The Ottoman dynasty was formally deposed. Abdulhamid, a cousin, was named Caliph only, not Sultan, giving him a religious role without political authority. It was a temporary arrangement and everyone knew it. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in July 1923, established the borders of the new Republic of Turkey. It was a more favorable treaty than anything a defeated power might have expected. Kemal's negotiating position was strong precisely because he had won the military war. Turkey retained Anatolia and Eastern Thrace. In return for the recognition of Turkish sovereignty, the treaty arranged one of the largest compulsory population exchanges in history. Approximately 1.2 million Orthodox Christians from Anatolia would be exchanged for approximately 400,000 Muslims from Greece, communities that had been rooted in Anatolia since before the Ottoman conquest. Greek Orthodox villages whose inhabitants spoke Turkish but observed Greek Orthodox Christianity were expelled in the name of a religious and ethnic boundary that had not previously existed as a political category. The exchange was carried out in months. People who had never been to Greece were sent there because they were Orthodox Christians. People who had never been to Turkey were sent there because they were Muslims. The Anatolian coast, which had been Greek-speaking and cosmopolitan for 3,000 years, was empty of its Greek communities. The Ottoman world's famous plurality, the Armenian merchants of Trabzon, the Greek fishermen of the Aegean coast, the Jewish traders of Salonika, the mixed neighborhoods of Istanbul, was being erased at the speed of a railway timetable. In October 1923, Turkey was formally declared a republic, with Mustafa Kemal as its first president. He would hold the position until his death in 1938, governing as an authoritarian modernizer with a vision of Turkish national identity that was secular, Western-oriented, and deliberately discontinuous with the Ottoman past. In March 1924, the Caliphate was abolished. Abdulhamid was put on his train to Switzerland. The abolition of the Caliphate was not a purely Turkish affair. It reverberated across the Islamic world in ways that are still being worked through a century later. The Caliph had been, for Sunni Muslims from Morocco to Indonesia, the symbolic head of the community of believers, not a pope, not a governing authority, but the living embodiment of Muslim political unity, the successor in an unbroken line to the companions of the Prophet. The abolition did not simply remove an old man from a train. It left a vacancy in the structure of Sunni political theology that no institution has filled. The question of what legitimate Islamic political authority looks like in the absence of a caliph has been a driver of Islamic political thought from the Muslim Brotherhood's founding in 1928 to the Islamic State's proclamation of a new caliphate in Mosul in 2014. The end of the Ottoman Caliphate is still being argued about. What had actually ended in 1924 was more than a dynasty. 600 years of a specific political civilization had concluded. The Ottoman Empire had not been simply a Turkish state. It had been a multi-ethnic, multi-religious imperial project that at its best governed an enormous diversity of peoples under a framework that provided order, legal protection, and a degree of communal autonomy. Its failure was not the failure of that project as an idea. It was the failure to reform fast enough, to modernize deeply enough, to find a political framework that could hold together in an age that was remaking every empire it touched into nations. The Tanzimat reformers of the 1830s and 1840s knew the empire needed to change. They built secular courts, modern schools, a telegraph network, a reformed military. They were not wrong. They were too slow, too dependent on European creditors who had their own interests, too embedded in an institutional structure that resisted every fundamental change. The Young Turks of 1908 inherited a reforming project that had been underway for 70 years and was still not complete. They added urgency and lost patience, and in losing patience, they also lost the multi-ethnic vision that had been the empire's reason for existing. The lines drawn at Sykes-Picot and adjusted at Lausanne created the map of the modern Middle East. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine. These were the units that European diplomats assembled from the Ottoman wreckage. They were assembled without regard for the communities that lived within those lines, without regard for the tribal, sectarian, and ethnic realities on the ground, and with the overriding concern of British and French strategic and economic interests. The wars that have convulsed Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine throughout the 20th and 21st centuries are not solely the legacy of those lines. History is never that simple, but the lines were drawn by people who knew they were creating contradictions and expected to manage those contradictions from a position of colonial authority that they would not maintain. There is a particular kind of tragedy in the Ottoman collapse that is different from the fall of most empires. The Roman Empire fell to external pressure, the migrations, the raids, the slow substitution of barbarian generals and federate armies for the legions. The Han dynasty fell to internal structural failure, the eunuch cycle, the great families, the peasant rebellions. The Ottoman Empire fell to a combination of both, but most specifically it fell to the gap between its own ambitions and its capacities at a moment when the world left no room for that gap to close gradually. The empire knew it was in trouble. It had been trying to solve the problem for nearly a century before the final collapse. It had produced reformers of genuine intelligence, Mustafa Rashid Pasha, Midhat Pasha, and the Young Turk intellectuals who drafted constitutions and imagined a modernized Ottoman state. It had produced a military officer who, when everything was lost, salvaged a viable national state from the wreckage with a strategic clarity and a sheer force of will that is rare in modern history. Mustafa Kemal did not save the Ottoman Empire. He ended it deliberately and built something different in its place. The question of whether what he built was worth what it cost, whether the homogeneous Turkish Republic justified the emptied Armenian highlands and the expelled Greek coastal communities, is a question that serious people still disagree about, and probably always will. And yet the story does not end neatly with an abolition decree or a treaty signature. Empires do not simply stop. They leave structures, grievances, populations, and borders behind, and those remainders keep generating history long after the institution itself has ceased to exist. The Ottoman collapse was the opening event of a century of Middle Eastern conflict whose specific character, the sectarian wars of Iraq, the civil war in Syria, the still unresolved question of Palestine, the recurring instability of Lebanon, the Kurdish national question that cuts across 4 modern states, cannot be understood without reference to the specific way that the Ottoman world was dismantled and divided. The British and French who drew those lines were not ignorant. They knew that Sunni and Shia communities coexisted with difficulty under a single administration. They knew that Kurdish populations were concentrated in mountains that crossed the territory of 4 separate colonial mandates. They knew that Jewish immigration to Palestine was occurring in the context of an Arab majority that had not been consulted about its future. They chose to proceed anyway, because the alternative, waiting for genuine self-determination, would have meant waiting for stability that might never come, and they wanted the oil and the strategic positions that came with control. The debt of that decision has been paid in wars that are still being fought. What is not in question is the scale of the ending. The last Caliph on his train to Switzerland, the empty bazaars of Smyrna, the geometric borders of Iraq, the mosques of Salonika turned into warehouses and then museums, the Armenian plateau where a people had lived since before the birth of Islam, empty of Armenians, 600 years of a world, 2 suitcases, and a map that is still being contested.